grandfather, which you were kind of hinting as well, his grandfather was a bit more full on in a different way, but he had the Shell radio program, and there's elements of his grandfather in the death of Bunny Munro, and but he was quite a sort of ferocious kind of and titanic kind of figure as well. So that male line, if you like, there's a lot of power, and there's a lot of drive and ambition, and they are very high achieving, very smart men. But then you kind of look at Nick's mum, Dawn, who's been much less talked about, who I spent heaps of time with.
Yeah, it sounds incredible as well.
She's such a, I mean, everybody says it, it feels corny, but she was, I mean, she only died a few months ago, but she's just this really lovely, beautiful woman. And of course, always when you meet people when they're old, there's this terrible thing of treating them as if they're somehow senile. Yeah. But Dawn was quite capable of immediately going into a conversation about Auden or T.S. Eliot or whatever. So, but I used to love going around to her place, because I'd go down to Melbourne, I'd interview all these people, and by the time I got to her place, I'd often be exhausted, and you know, she'd make me tea and make me a meal. And
was she in the same house? Did they give up that family home?
No, it wasn't the family home.
No,
she had her own place, and I just, apart from obviously being there to talk to her about Nick and the family, I would just enjoy kind of hanging out with her, because she was just such a cool woman and so smart, and she had a real kind of low, sort of dry level of humour, and you know, like looking back at stuff and talking about like Nick complaining about how he's representing the media, and she would say, Nick, well, Nick, you do like to exaggerate when you tell your stories, you know. So, I mean, she was very smart, very funny.
She's a librarian.
She was a librarian. She was also sort of a violinist in her youth. And I think people don't realise how much of an influence, I mean, it's too simple to say that Nick got the drive and the artistic influence from his father and the sensitivity from his mother. That's way too simple. But there is a kind of element of that, you know. There's a kindness that came from Dawn, and a humour. And she was a very smart, artistically minded person as well. So it's a constellation, but for sure there were those sort of dynamics there, you know, going on. And I don't know, you know, like Dawn was just a fantastic person. You know, it's like having a second mum.
Yeah, and Nick is so loyal to her.
Very loyal. He would come home he would tour, he tours or would tour every summer, and he timed the tours to be there at Christmas, and obviously, but really his father's car accident was very early in January, and so basically he was returning every year, and I don't think he may have missed 1 or 2 years at most. If he missed the exact date, it was only by weeks, but he would always be there for her on the anniversary of his father's death, and that's how much his mother meant to him, and that's how important it was to him.
And he lived at home until they went to the UK, is that right?
Oh yeah, well yeah, like all the others, obviously, you know, like we're
22.
talking about a time when people normally were out of home by 17, 18, and all his friends were like, you know, Nick was obviously a pretty wild boy, and they're all his friends, and like, well, why isn't he home with his mum still? You know, trying to figure it out. But Nick had it good. Nick had it real good, you know. Even when he was in the UK later, like Dawn would send him, you know, checks for $50 to keep him floating while he was the demonic hell child of heroin and sort of satanic rock and roll. And it's like calling up mum from London, you know, I'm a bit broke, mum, can you send me $50? So, yeah, and Dawn will, you know, telegram it to him in the old fashioned way.
Okay, before we move out of Wangaratta, I just want you to read that.
Sorry, I'm jumping around.
No, it jumps around, and there is no, as Nick says, there's no linear path, is there?
Well, I tried to have some lines, you know, otherwise you'd go crazy.
Well, it is chronological, but you do go back and forth a bit. But
yeah,
that's life. Okay.
But I feel weird talking about Nick in the ways that I am, because I'm not Nick. I mean, I'm only reporting on what everybody said to me, and it's a version, and I'm sure there'll be other versions, you know, most critically Nick's version of himself. And there's probably, do we ever have a definitive version of ourselves, really, you know, in terms of our memories and what shapes us. I mean, that was another reason I was interested, not just in major figures, but lesser known people in Nick's life, and that sort of quarrel and shift around moments and key incidents and what they were about. And often there are 3 or 4 views and there's no reconciliation between them. They're just different and they're in a state of sort of vibration and tension. And that is why they are still alive to each person to this day. And I'm sure all of us here in this room and online have moments in our past where we see things in a certain very definite way, and then we encounter someone else and their view of it is radically different. You don't have to look at a relationship breakup to kind of see
or childhood memories, you know, you tell your parents, oh, this happened. No, it didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
So what, do you mind reading? Are you happy to read?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I've chosen, it's quite a turning point in the story. It's basically when Nick leaves Wangaratta. But
oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, from here, I think all the way over to yeah, all of it.
Oh, the whole
lot? Right? Is that
sure.
okay?
Okey-dokey. Yeah, I feel like I'm
an
reading
author?
to the kids or something, or a bit of both, you know. Okay, I should have brought my glasses. But anyway,
I can
didn't think
read
of that. All right. Something else was beginning to make its appeal felt to Nick. A mix of music, landscape and literature, stirring up a new sense of language within him. The first book that I read where I felt a real quickening of the heart in regard to language was when I was 10 years old, when I was reading a Tarzan novel by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and it described a lion resting in the jungle and spasmodically moving its tail. I remember very clearly getting a physical charge from that word, loving it, but not knowing what it meant, he says. Nick had a makeshift bedroom arrangement, sleeping in what was effectively a sunroom. It was the room where you went through on the way to the toilet. Where I lay, I had my head right beside this old boiler. An adjoining room functioned as Julie's bedroom, his sister. She'd cry out, "Nick, tell me a story," and he would relish the opportunity almost every night. The deal they brokered was that Julie would make him a hot chocolate each morning in exchange for a tale. Julie recalls Nick had to almost shout the stories out to me, or speak quite loudly anyway. They both refer to what Nick calls a favourite one, about a deep sea diver going down deep into the water looking for gold. At various moments during the dive, sharks and other forms of danger approach. Nick would provoke shrieks of fear in Julie. Eventually, the diver finds the bar of gold he is seeking and comes to the surface. And it turns out it's just a little kid in a bath with a block of soap, imagining it all. Nick looks a little sheepish when he retells the story now. I was only 12, he adds defensively. In fact, Julie is not sure Nick actually came up with the story on his own, or if he absorbed it from somewhere and forgot its origins. Not that it mattered. He developed a litany of horror stories and scary tales, delighting in Julie's terror. "Yeah, I cut my teeth on her," he says, smiling. One of my favourite contemporary authors is the crime writer James Lee Burke, says Nick, who writes the most beautiful descriptive prose about the town of New Iberia in Louisiana, Spanish moss, the Bayou Teche, antebellum houses, purple mists, rattling lightning, etc., etc. I love the way he wrote about it so much. I went there on my honeymoon with Susie. We drove around Arizona, Colorado, through Texas and down south, saw New Iberia on the map and headed there. All the way, me telling Susie how beautiful this place would be because of what I had read in his 20 or so novels. When we arrived, it was actually full of Burger Kings and McDonald's and all the rest of that shit that American small towns consist of these days. But beneath it, deep down, you could sense Burke's ghosted vision of his hometown rising up. It was a deeply selective representation and all about memory and its spirits. And so it is with me and Wangaratta. James Lee Burke says, "I've come to learn that memory and presence are inextricably connected and should never be seen as separate entities. This is so true. The past is always there calling to us. Whether it be Ned Kelly rising from the fog or my father crunching down the garden path lane late at night, or the spirits of our absent friends reminding us that there is still much to know and much to learn. In my memory, Wangaratta is a magical place where only good things ever happen. The swinging rope, the willow trees, the railway bridge, the pylons, the roots of half-submerged trees rising out of the muddy water, all that stuff. It's there in Bluebird, Carry Me, Sad Waters, Your Funeral, My Trial, Where the Wild Roses Grow. If a song has a river in it, it's that spot in Wangaratta, just under the train's tracks where we used to go as kids, he says. It's an idyllic substructure that sorrowful tales of corrupted innocence can rest upon. I wouldn't trade all that for anything. I was both terrified and excited when I left, but I remember feeling deep down that I was being sent away. I was always under the impression that I was asked to leave Wangaratta High School, but now I wonder if that's true. Mum says she sent me to Melbourne to save me from Wang, but I remember it as being kicked out of high school. Whatever the reason, I certainly felt at the time I was being sent to Melbourne because I was too much trouble. That's not to say I felt like my mum and dad didn't love me. I always felt that. I always felt supported by them and that they had a special place in their hearts for me. The trouble thing that was supported by the fact that at the first class I was in at Caulfield Grammar School, the teacher came into the classroom, pointed straight at me and said, "Sit down, Cave, we've heard all about you." I felt this comment very deeply because it supported the notion that I had left Wangaratta under a cloud of strife. And as I knew no one there, I felt very isolated. So I felt ashamed and lonely, but I also remember feeling angry, like, who the fuck are you? You don't know anything about me. So like I say, Wang represents a childhood ideal, the river, the ghost gums, magpies, the rangers, the swimming pool, the paper run, my bike, the mighty tree we would climb, the footpaths that would fry our bare, hard feet, storm drains, yabby dams, the high bridges we jumped off, swim holes, vast star-filled skies, the living moon, the smell of a storm coming in the dust, the stench of the abattoirs as you came into town from the Glenrowan end, the nests of redback spiders out in the compost, snakes, the wool mills. They're all symbols of my childhood that come up repeatedly in my songwriting and that connect to a sense of childish wonder that was lost, or at least changed when I left to go to boarding school in Melbourne at age 13. I caught the train to Melbourne and the world changed into something different, complicated, and ultimately adversarial for me. It would never be the same again. Yeah. Fantastically articulate, Nick, when he wants to be. Not bad. No, fantastic. I mean,
So do you know why I chose that part? I mean, do you?
Well, I mean, I know why I chose it.
Yeah.
Well. So, one, because it was just so beautifully articulate. Two, because kind of Nick spotlights the thing that I was talking about earlier in a more beautifully articulate way, which is that our memories are these sort of dreams that linger within us, and we find a kind of resource within them that gives us our creativity and our being. And we know that it's a kind of, that memory is a kind of fantasy, but still in the way that he talked about New Iberia. I'm sure even when he returns to Wangaratta and sees degrees of harshness and mundanity, he still sees the dream place as well within it. You know, when I went to Wangaratta, I went down to the bridge where he jumped in from the railway tracks into the river. Like, I stood near the pylons. You know, I saw other kids kind of walking around and riding their push bikes, and I sat in the park where he would have sat near the tree that he climbed. And actually, when I did that, particularly the memory of sitting in the park, that was when I knew I could write something really special, because I thought, wow, I know this place, even though I'd never been there, because I'm from a suburban Australian background, and where Nick lived, the swimming pool is nearby. It's suburbia, but there's a sort of semi-industrial area of warehouses and factories literally on the next block. There's the stormwater drains, and that's exactly the kind of zone that I was raised in Newcastle. It wasn't a country town, it was an industrial town. But I think many of us can relate to this sense of an Australian suburban landscape of one kind or another, and how when we're young, which we're sort of wanting to get out of it and imagining all this other magical world, but the magical world is actually already with us, and our act of dreaming in that landscape is going to kind of bring the landscape with us when we go out into the world, and we'll realize that the dream actually was always there inside us, and it's kind of back there, and it's our nourishment and our ghost. Yeah.
And so how did you research for Melbourne, for example? I mean, Melbourne's sort of like the second half of the book. So it starts off in the country town in Wangaratta, and then slowly, you know, is it Caulfield Grammar, which, by the way, is exactly where I grew up. So that was super interesting for me.
Okay.
I grew up in Caulfield, so it was very interesting. And then all of St Kilda, Fitzroy Street. I mean, so how did you feel about, did you know those places? Did you?
No, I mean, I'm not a Melbourne guy. Like I say, I'm from Newcastle. Yeah, most of my life I was brought up there. You know, part of my upbringing involved living in Arnhem Land. My father was a miner, so. But I don't know, like it's the strange echoes. Like I felt those connections to Nick's country upbringing in Wangaratta, and I understood that sort of Melbourne landscape, particularly as they get older and they're becoming young men and women, and the whole crystal ballroom scene's accelerating, because that reminded me of coming to Sydney and being part of this sort of trade union club, Southern Cross Hotel kind of vibe, and the sort of post-punk scene in Sydney. So there are always these sort of echoing things, but I was definitely nervous about writing about Melbourne because it's got a very rich cultural history, and getting things right about the locations, and locations that, like a Topolino's pizza place,
which I know,
where people would gather and they'd be smashed, and they start eating the sugar, because particularly when you have heroin, sometimes you crave sweetness. And also they were just jerking around and making trouble as well. And you know, the fish and chip shop where they scored drugs from, the Crystal Ballroom itself, which was the kind of palatial place, like to try and bring that to life was a challenge as well. So that involved a lot of research and talking to people, and the secondary sort of historical sources that were all there, and looking all the time. When you're writing stuff like that, you're looking for tiny details as well as significant facts. I mean, the best way I can explain that is not so much to do with sort of landscape and history, but as an example, there's a part of the book where the Boys Next Door's first manager, Karen Marks, talks about the band coming round to sack her, and Nick was the one to basically give her the bird. And she's pretty funny about how she describes Nick, hilarious actually. But she said something to me about how while Nick was sacking her, he was eating twisties. And I was so, oh God, I was just like, oh, fantastic, that's so good.
And
so,
she remembers that as well.
Oh yeah, of course, you know. But so those are the kind of details as a writer you're looking for, because immediately that kind of zooms you in. And Nick talks about it in relation to the spasmodic moving of the tail, and he's dead right. You're looking for certain words, certain details that just kind of zero you in and plant you inside the story. You know, that's what you want to, where you want to take people, inside the story, and you want them to not only know it, you want them to feel it, and you want them to inhabit it. And in a lot of ways, that inhabitation is something that I'm trying to do to myself, because I'm trying to create a sort of inner cinema for the reader, but an inner cinema for me as the writer, in order to have some sort of cogent sort of energy as well as narrative flowing through what I'm doing. Yeah.
And what would you say were some of your, I mean, there is so much going on in this book. Like I was just saying to someone, I think I'll have to read it again, because it's like once you get to Melbourne and St Kilda and that year, it's just, You know,
Yeah.
you can't believe that. I kept thinking he must be 3 years older by now, but he's not. That's how much happened in that year.
I forget myself. I mean, that they're only 18, 19, 20. You know,
Yeah.
they're just kids.
It's extraordinary.
You know, I mean, in fact, I wish I'd just given a bit more emphasis to reminding people of that, because
You do it.
it does get kind of darker and nastier, and you know, like obviously in the present climate, you know, people are just kind of quick fire judging people left, right, and centre. And it's really important to remember that all the people in this story were basically still teenagers, and their artistic hunger and their sort of their kind of brilliance, really, and their flamboyance and their sort of aggressive imagining of where they wanted to go and what they wanted to be. You've got to kind of keep it in your mind of how young they were, and it fits into being young. Like we all, I mean, maybe there are people who are 18, and I'm saying we remember, you know, but you know, for sure, there's this. You are exploding out of yourself at this stage.
Hang on 1 second. I don't know what just happened. Oh,
We ran out of
sorry.
time.
No, we've lost the Zoom. Can you see us? Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah.
can't see
When you're young, you are when you're a teenager, you are exploding out of yourself. You know, there's a kind of restlessness about who and what you are, and it's a shared thing, and then you start to form. Your friends are like a gang, you know.
But I think when you say that about the hunger, though, there's one point in an interview with Nick where he says he still has that hunger.
Yeah.
And I think that's just what separates Nick from a lot of other performers that don't last this long, don't reinvent themselves all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's that hunger. What do you think, Sam?
Absolutely. He's amazing. I mean, he's constantly absorbing new things, and he's looking to move forward. And I think this latest phase of his career, from Push the Sky Away through Skeleton Tree to Ghostine, is really quite amazing, that he can kind of develop a whole new creative phase. And I'm sure he will have fresh phases again. I think he's getting better as he grows older. That's a pretty amazing sort of thing to...
Do you think that's partly due to, I mean, there's a lot of talk throughout the book and from other people in the book about his work ethic and his father's work ethic, and seeing that and that competition necessarily. I'm not sure that's true, but, you know.
There was definitely some competition between him and his father in the earlier days, and a sense of wanting to match and better his father's achievements, for sure. But I think it's gone way beyond that kind of stuff now. But the work ethic that Nick has is really kind of something else, you know. I mean, a few people talk about it in the book, and because a lot of people don't like Nick, they have issues with him. They feel that he's a kind of magpie who has stolen from them. They feel he's been an arsehole to them, particularly when he was a drug addict. They feel that he is a fake, which I think is the stupidest criticism at all, because do I think Robert De Niro is a fake when he's in Taxi Driver, or do I think Tom Waits is a fake when he's pretending to be this sort of bohemian person walking down a kind of dream-strewn alleyway in a video clip? No, I think that they're a great artists sort of making sort of magical work and sort of translating their feelings about life into a sort of another sort of dimension. But Nick's a polarizing artist, no doubt about it, and on a creative level and on a personal level. But no matter what you think about Nick, I think it's incontestable that his cultural significance is now decisive and just a straight up historical fact. And to me, I would like people to read the biography and read it because they're interested not just in Nick pro or con, but in the whole kind of environment and history in the landscapes of Wangaratta and Melbourne, out of which he developed. And what I was trying to say in my big ramble here was that a number of people in the book who don't especially like Nick, or who've had some frictions with him, acknowledge that Nick deserves his success because he works so fucking hard and because he's talented. And Karen Marks says it, who I was mentioning before. Bronwyn Bonnie says it, who was in Crime and City Solution and helped Nick with And the Ass or the Angel as an editor. And Ron Rood is a really interesting character, also talks about it. He was a musician on the scene at the same time as Nick and the Boys Next Door. And they're dead right, and there's the envy is another thing that kind of affects how people disdain Nick, But I hate to say it, but there's that really awful Australian thing as well. The tall poppy thing. You're even mentioning it's like a cliche, but it's true. It still exists, Like, it's like we can't bear people doing well.
I think also what I got a sense of Nick was is the work ethic, but also, like you said, his not just love of art, but he's sort of, he's committed to art on such a level, not just singing, not just, literature, poetry. He's got such a commitment to the art that sort of is sort of outside of him in a way. So it's not even about him in a way.
Well, I mean, he wanted to be a painter. He studied at, was it Caulfield Tech? I mean, my mental block, but so after he left high school, his ambitions were to be a painter. And really, Nick wanted to be like Brett Whiteley when he was a teenager. Brett Whiteley was his hero. He had a lot of other artistic interests. He loved the German expressionist Egon Schiele. He was interested in Goya. A whole bunch of painters that are classically a young art student would be fascinated by. And his teachers sort of remark upon him as being either at least very competent, and one teacher in particular, Jenny Watson, who's quite a well-known painter herself, says Nick was a really good painter and had a lot of promise, but he failed art school. His focus was becoming more about the band. He was becoming more sort of perverse in his sort of behaviour, and more and more unruly, and it just all kind of went off the rails. And I think that actually kind of hurt him, really, and hurt his ego. But the band just took centre space. But like he has all that sort of interest, and then there's his love of literature, and which comes through his father, who was his father. Really, in some respects, was kind of like a bit of a failed writer. But his father was involved very critically in the Melbourne sort of drama scene, the Melbourne theatre, and his father could recite swathes of Shakespeare and Nabokov and Dostoevsky and all these different people. So Nick learnt a lot from his father. I think particularly from the theatrical stuff as much as the novelistic interest, because I think Nick picked up the performing sensibilities that fascinated his father.
I think one of those telling scenes is in that video clip. It's now a very famous video clip for Shiva. Is it for Shiva?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Where he pretty much directs himself and has a mirror and needs to see himself. But it's not about, it's because he really wants to direct himself, right? And I think that's such a telling scene of how much he knew his performance meant.
Yeah.
And
just so people understand, with the film clip for Shiva, Nick asks for a mirror, and then he does all that sort of slow kind of, and the Paul Goldman, who filmed it, jokes about Nick being such a narcissist. He was just tangling himself in knots, looking at himself, making love to himself, found it pretty amusing. But Nick was interested in that Egon Schiele stuff of the sort of tormented, the tormented body, and he was acting. And maybe that goes a little bit to the criticism, Nick's just a fake. He's not a fake. He's totally for real.
Well, I've got more questions, but I know we're going to run out of time. So does anyone in the audience or Zoom have any questions?
There's one question.
Okay.
You want to go first? It's from Ella Mitchell, and she's asked, did Nick publish any of his poetry? And I would love to read some for Mark.
How do you mean publish his poetry? I'm not sure what that means. Like when he was young, I know his father published poetry in a local paper, satirical stuff, making fun of the smells of the abattoir.
Oh, no, she means you. Have you published any poetry?
Oh, me? Oh, really? Oh, jeez. I think that one's from my sister. Is it?
It's my friend, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah, I've got a book of poetry called
Funeral Rites?
Darlinghurst Funeral Rites. Thank you. Which is about the whole post-punk music scene in Sydney in the 80s. So the subject matter is actually similar. I mean, obviously this stuff interests and obsesses me because it connects to my own kind of growing up experiences, my own ambitions to artistically, and you know, without kind of wanting to kind of overstate it, I used to have great raves with Nick about all this sort of stuff, you know, and he's so easy to talk to because it's the history and the culture that we've been affected by. So, you know, you find yourself talking about Brett Whiteley, you find yourself talking about Tarkovsky films, you find yourself talking about Alice Cooper, or you find yourself talking about, I don't know, silly stuff that you know, Bewitched, and you know, and how much you used to fancy Morticia and the Addams Family, and you know, all the stuff that you would talk about with any friend of a similar sort of age, right? So it but there's other levels to it, of course, but it's also it's how we are. It's what we've grown up with. It's what sort of formed us in pop culture and in sort of more sort of high brow culture.
No, so, yeah.
Has Nick read the book?
You want to ask part two?
Yeah. I guess has Nick read the book, and if so, what was his response to it?
No, well, I don't know if he's read the book. I sent him a copy about maybe a month ago, but it took a couple of weeks to get there because of all the COVID-19 sort of business. He was sort of totally on board with the project. And even when it went all sort of belly up and I was just a real mess, he was really great to me and never really hassled me too much. Maybe every now and then he'd say, "How's that fucking book going, Mark?" I remember that. But he would just, he was like a genuinely concerned person as to my sort of, you know, welfare and waywardness. So I can only say good things about Nick in that respect. You know? And it only changed after the death of Nick's son, and not even immediately. And Nick wanted me to stop what I was doing, and I refused to do that because I had other sort of commitments, and legal and contractual amongst them. And it sort of kind of became a bit of a standoff situation where Nick, it's just more in a kind of neutral zone. So I don't know if Nick will respond or not. I mean, lately it's been like I had a brief interaction with him not that long ago that was friendly. So, but you know, I mean, I said this, I think I said this in the book, but I've certainly said it to friends. It's kind of like you have a working relationship and then you diverge and you just don't sort of hang out with those people anymore. And I used to see lots of people wanting to try and attach themselves to Nick, and something about that sort of appalled me, and I didn't really ever want to sort of disenfranchise myself by doing that kind of thing. So I always maintained a little bit of an element of distance. And again, I discussed this in the book, and it can feel a bit weird because inevitably working on a biography, you become friends with someone, and that puts you in a kind of strange place because you're observing them and they're your subject, but you become more sort of involved with them, and it goes into really sort of strange zones, and especially if you get on well with someone and you have a lot in common. So I don't know, I'm rambling again, but I think it would be weird for Nick to read it, really. Like,
So you haven't had any feedback?
No feedback. He might say something on the Red Hand Files, because I'm sure someone will write in and say, "Hey, what do you reckon about that?" So I don't know. Hopefully he'll or say nice things. I don't know.
What's your favourite book of yours?
Well, actually, I really like the Sick Bag Song, which is the poetry he wrote on the road in America. I think there's something really special about that, like funny and beautiful, and it's just kind of quite original. But that's probably a bit of an eccentric taste one. Bunny Munro really amused me, but yeah, I think the Sick Bag Song is really the best of his. And The Ass or the Angel, his first novel that was heavily influenced by Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor and early Cormac McCarthy too. That's got great moments in it, but it's hard work. The language is so thick. He was only 27, 28, writing it. And yeah, I just don't think it's one that you could sort of, it's nice in bits, but it's hard going for again, to go back to.
Yes, Davina.
You talked about loving, sort of going down the sort of finding something and going deep on it. What's been your favourite sort of down the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole? What's been your favourite one of those?
I think my favourite rabbit hole, if you can call it that, was really Wangaratta itself. It was like I look at the chapter I wrote about Wangaratta, and I feel like it's like some sort of rock and roll kind of Year My Voice Broke meets Catcher in the Rye. There's just the amount of information and detail I got about the place, and like I felt like I was trying to reconjure my own childhood out of it, really, and that was what made me love it so much. And I mean, having said that, I start thinking about the sort of the Crystal Ballroom thing, and the way in which we were kind of flooded by all these musical references. So how you would wait months to get a copy of the New Musical Express, and you would order a record, and it would take 6 weeks to 8 weeks to arrive, and then you would sit and you would study the record, like the front of the cover, and then the back of the cover, and then the lyrics, and you listen and listen and listen, and that kind of stuff was really interesting to me to kind of dig into and revive as well. And again, I mean, there's this saying that goes back to the Renaissance portraitist, that the portrait painter always paints himself. And it was a kind of warning as well to artists, but it was about that notion that any sort of portrait of someone is a representation of you as well. And it's something that you need to be mindful of, because if you're not mindful of it, you can lose your sort of objectivity about what you're doing in terms of looking at that person. And it's also an admission of that there's a sort of finite sensibility about your gaze. It's not definitive. It is only it is only a glimpse. It is only a glimpse, And I was always kind of conscious of that kind of thing as well. I'm probably not answering your question very well, but all of it was interesting. It was really, I mean, it is, it's what I love about nonfiction generally and writing, that you're kind of at this rolling university, and anything that takes your fancy, And Nick actually introduced me to a lot of really interesting poets, Frederick Seidel in particular, who's this sort of kind of vicious, aristocratic American poet with a kind of musical sort of and rhythmic sort of verve to his work. And then I'm trying to think of, there's another guy that's really important to Nick too, who's, I should know off by heart, who has a more sort of shamanistic kind of approach and an interest in sound and sort of ethnic and tribal sort of poetries. And I think that's been a big influence on how Nick's music, how Nick's lyrics have shifted and become more abstract and free and less overtly storytelling, but also that sort of sound thing that he's gone on with Warren Ellis too. Jerome Rothenberg, that's the guy, his work. So he's a kind of ethno-poetic anthropologist beat kind of figure, and that's been a big influence on Nick, and it was really interesting to get into all that. So it's kind of like studying Nick and studying his musical, cinematic and literary influences. That was a real help to me just as a creative person, as a human being. You know, I didn't like everything that he liked by any means. Like some of it I was like, oh man, you know, I just can't get into this. But
it's
I
like an
tried.
education though. I mean,
Yeah,
I
it's
felt
an
like this was an education.
Yeah, it's an
There's
education.
so many people I'm going to look up now.
You know, John Berryman was another really interesting American poet, you know, terrible, tormented drunk who wrote dream songs. And Berryman's really interesting because he writes in a theatrical format with 3 different voices that kind of interrogate his identity and way of seeing the world from different angles. And, you know, that was interesting too, because I think in a way that was probably an influence on the book too, in terms of what I was already doing, which was looking at Nick through what Nick said, and then looking at Nick through what Mick Harvey said, and then looking at Nick through what his childhood friends said, and looking at Nick through what his mother said, and looking at Nick. So there's this constant sort of sense of, you know, like it's like the Milky Way, you know, there's all these voices, some sharp, some very faint, and you're getting a sense of this universe, and the universe isn't just Nick world, it's the world Nick was in, you know, so you're painting this bigger picture, you know. That's really interesting.
I think Davina had a question.
Great interview, thank you very much, both of you. But do you think Nick coming out every year and, you know, seeing his family and his old friends has kind of, just as you said, that Milky Way, kept the people that had been throughout his life sort of, like he kept calling on the same people to come back into the bands to play with him, because he hasn't lived here forever.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, obviously some felt expelled by the way Bookstore and, you know, Roller moved away, but, you know, he has sort of had strength in his familiar,
Loyalty.
you know, which is sort of a real family man kind of thing as well. I think. Do you think this the coming out here has helped maintain his sense of where he has come from?
Oh, for sure. You know, I mean, he's a classic Melbourne artist. You know, there's no doubt about that. And I think, I mean, you know, like Nick's a very famous guy now, but he's always kind of been famous stroke notorious from when he was a teenager. By the end of this book, you know, he's a Melbourne icon already on some sort of cult level. But I think, I don't know how many, like Nick's real friends are part of that real close Melbourne fraternity, you know, that like, so obviously his working relationship, which came about later actually with Warren Ellis, you know, he's the Boys Next Door was a school band, you know, and so he and Mick Harvey knew each other since like second form, you know. It's like, wow, you know, they were together for 30 years, you know, that's lasting a lot longer than most marriages, you know. So it's a pretty amazing kind of sense of intimacy and growth to sort of go from your kind of mid-teens to, you know, one of the sort of greatest artists, you know, in the world. Not bad. Mick, you did well, says the principal. And yeah, Polly Borland, yeah, the photographer, you know, she was part of that scene. John Hillcoat, the filmmaker. So yeah, I'm sure. I think though it's a bit of a contradictory thing. I think there's a sense of returning and being kind of recharged by the past, and then also returning and sometimes finding that you're being kind of contained or sort of pulled back by the past and by old friendships. And, you know, so that's present in the book. You get a sense of of Nick needing the contact with people, and an exhibition about his life is obviously about those friendships and places like Melbourne and Wangaratta and later on as well. But I think you also get a sense that he feels a bit put upon by it too. So it's not an entirely harmonious kind of thing by any means. I don't know, hard to say.
Yeah, I actually had that as a question as well, that
Oh,
I felt like there was this loyalty versus letting go all the
Yeah.
time, of people, of places, and he's always going in between both. And I don't think do you think it's changed, even meeting him now?
well,
And
I think
life's changed a lot for him now, I think, yeah.
the thing I do think is that Nick is a forward-moving person. So the people that you might say he let go of, I don't know if it's even that sort of conscious. He is just going forward, and where his work is concerned, people are involved. And where they're no longer involved with his work, they're no longer involved with him.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. That's the deal. Apart from maybe really, really tight, close, intimate
family,
people,
yeah.
like family, you know, people like Polly, you know. But he's working with Polly all the time anyway. Like, the work is the core kind of, it's the soul of it, you know, absolutely.
Any more questions out there? Or does that just answer everything? Anything online? Okay. I mean, there's one question that I probably could have asked at the very beginning.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm still, I mean, it's kind of a silly question, but why Nick Cave? Like, why was this the biography for you to write?
Well, I wasn't into it at first. The funny thing
Were
is,
you commissioned? Like, what?
no, I wasn't commissioned. The idea
Yeah.
was put to me by Jack Marks,
Oh,
right?
God.
Of all people.
Okay.
Jack said to me, "Hey, Mark, you should write a biography of Nick Cave." And I went, "Nah." You know, and I said, "I'm not interested in subsuming myself under someone else's life, you know, Mr. Independent." And anyway, I just thought about it, and I thought, well, I have interviewed Mick Harvey a few times, and I've seen Nick perform with the Birthday Party and the Bad Seeds right through their entire histories. And I've interviewed Wim Wenders, and I've interviewed this person and that person, and I've sort of been writing about rock and roll for 30 years and cinema for 30
In
years.
Australia.
And I started adding up, and after a while, I began to just, I thought, holy hell, I know everybody. and at dawn, I thought, actually, that's a really good idea. So I began to kind of put together the concept. But I wasn't, like, I really wasn't an obsessed fan. And even now, I'm not the kind of person who can suddenly snap into telling you what year something came out and what the lyrics to this and that song have within them. I'd have to go back, and this is why I've joked about before, like my memory's not that red hot. If you put me on some quiz show, I'd probably bomb out and be beaten by Joe Smith in Bulla Dealer, the Nick Cave expert, and just walk away, you know, ashamed of myself. You know, like what I can do well, I would like to think, is research stuff, and with, you know, all the bits and pieces around me, and with Google in front of me and a few other things to help me, I can put the pieces together and create patterns and tell a story, you know. But it can be like cramming for an exam, and it just all kind of goes out your head again.
But you knew like were going to be, you know, researching one of Australia's greatest.
Yeah, sure, of course.
And
I knew that's the pleasure and the challenge, you know. Like, you never want to go into something where there's not enough to say. I mean, that would be
there's plenty to say.
True hell.
You stopped at
true hell.
1980. There's clearly a lot to say.
Well,
Yeah. So what's happening after 1980?
You know, so
Can we expect part 2?
Well, a few people ask me that, like volume 2, maybe. You know, I've got enough material for London, Berlin, Sao Paulo, and that's the true Inferno, because that's Nick at what some would feel is his absolute creative peak that's never been matched, particularly those people who prefer the collaboration with Nick Harvey over the collaboration with Warren Ellis. And it's obviously, you know, all through Nick's heroin addiction and when he was a real sort of artistic nomad. But the thought of the work I put into this and what it cost me personally, I mean, all I'd say to people is, well, you know, if they back up a gigantic truck of gold and money, maybe my vibe will change, you know, and then I'll go, oh, you know what? I suddenly feel inspired again. But I'm not diving back into it. I've got other stuff I want to do as well.
Well, let's see how much you miss Nick.
Yeah, well, you know, you know, I'm sure we'll catch up somewhere place or other, you know.
And yes,
Yeah, you think is the likes of Nick and his formative years, do you think he's a bit of a dying breed? Can we make them again, or is he just a unique meteor that struck us?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if people heard it online, but the gist of it is if people are, if Nick's a kind of a one-off and a sort of dying breed, and we wouldn't get someone like that in their youth. There might be some truth to that because Nick's education, it was so profound. I mean, you know, his father was a education dynamo and a theatre director. His mother was a librarian, a classical violinist, you know, with a deep love of literature. Nick read voraciously. Obviously, kids don't read voraciously in the way that they used to. I mean, I hate to sort of think that I guess the genius would just come in a different form, but maybe it's not so much it's the literary thing that I think is the missing ingredient, because literature helps you to tell big stories. So you kind of get a sort of more like an imagination, like a planet, whereas the sort of, you know, the spasmodic, to use a word, nature of how people are mediated through iPhones sort of creates something more fractured. You know, maybe sampling kind of is a mode to sort of kind of respond to that creatively. But Nick is a pretty exceptional artist, and it seems like he's ascended to a place that he really is going to that place where Leonard Cohen and Bowie and Dylan are, you know. I mean, in some respects, Nick was probably a bit unlucky because, you know, the one thing that he probably can't have is the kind of cultural influence and importance and the centrality that Bowie and Dylan had because of the time they were born in, just, you know, 10, 15 years earlier, you know, when music was much more of a centre focus in our culture. Yeah, I don't know. I don't like to think he's the last of some sort of dying breed, but he's a pretty rare cat, that's for sure. You know?
I just wanted to share that last year when Ghosteen came out, I was in New York, and the story started on the front page of the New York Times.
About it?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
That was incredible.
Well, Rowan S. Howard said it in the documentary Autoluminescence, and I have thought the same thing right through, and I still think it to this day. And I noticed the difference when I was in London and when I was in Berlin. People really have got no idea just how successful, just how famous, and just how respected Nick is, and how respected he has been for quite a while. And yeah, here we recognise it to a degree, but I don't think we really know quite to the extent the mark that Nick has made.
okay. Any more Zoom questions? Okay. I think we're going to, we're going to do some signings and stuff if that's all right.
Sure.
But I want to end, if you don't mind.
Oh.
You say near the end of the book that Nick has sent you a poem.
Oh yeah, the
The
mower.
mower.
Yeah.
And I thought, Maybe we could just read that poem to end the night. This is what Nick sent Mark. How many times has he sent it to you?
I must have sent it 3 or 4 times. He forgot, you know, like you'll do. Because we're obviously 10 years is going. And I mean, he was sending it to himself as much as me, really.
Yeah,
you know,
but I think if
'cause
we
he's
want to
obviously
know
reading
how
it.
Nick's where Nick's at right now, I think it's I read the poem. It's very short. Can you read that?
Yeah, sure. The Mower by Philip Larkin. The mower stalled twice. Kneeling, I found a hedgehog jammed up against the blades. Killed, it had been in the long grass. I had seen it before and even fed it once. Now I had mauled its unobtrusive world unmendably. Burial was no help. Next morning I got up and it did not. The first day after a death, the new absence is always the same. We should be careful of each other. We should be kind while there is still time.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you. Please give a big hand to Mark.
Thank you.
We've got a little book for you down here. This has been a little bit nice.
Yeah.
Is it out of there?
Thank you. Wow, cool. Thanks. And apologies for being late. Bondi, I just could not get a
Oh,
park.
blame it on Bondi.
I'm going to be whinging about that for another decade. That'll be my next book.
That
Thanks.
never happens in the inner west.
No way. No way. Never, ever, 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 ever.